Josh, thank you very much for coming this morning.
Thank you. Well, good morning, everyone. First of all, I do want to say this is not my first Madison Forum meeting, and I enjoy very much, and I think it's unique to this organization to have that opportunity for members to speak about different issues, and I always learn something from that. So I appreciate all the comments this morning. What I would like to do today is to spend a little time telling you about myself. I know some of the folks here, but just give you a little bit about my background, a little bit about why I'm seeking the office of Secretary of State, what I hope to do, and then what I'd really like to do, if there's some time, is to answer questions that you may have. First, just sort of a general comment about my time at the legislature and kind of looking into 2018. There was a comment made, which I appreciated very much, about transformational leadership that needs to happen at the level of state government. And the people in this room have a tremendous opportunity next year. As frustrated as I have been down at the legislature, I am incredibly optimistic about the future of Georgia state government, because I believe that on May 22nd of next year in the Republican primary, that the same voters who came out, 38% of them voted for Donald Trump for president in the Republican primary, 24% of them voted for Ted Cruz for president in the Republican primary. 62% of Republican primary voters clearly saying, we want a change agent. We want a transformational change in leadership. Well, you're going to have those choices up and down the ballot in every single race, but it's going to be up to all of us to communicate that. The other general comment I wanted to make, really about Michael and Garland. One of the real great things about my public service in the General Assembly has been seeing people who they have nothing to gain financially from doing this. They just are so passionate about government and trying to see that government operates the way it should, that they give of themselves, self-sacrifice down at the Capitol day after day. You have this army of lobbyists on the third floor who are being paid by all these special interest groups. And then you got folks like Michael and Garland. And I'm just so grateful for y'all and your commitment to good government and honest government. Having said that, let me tell you just a little bit about myself, a little bit about why I'm running for Secretary of State and what I hope to accomplish. My background, I'm from Columbus, Georgia. My great-grandfather moved to Columbus, Georgia to have an opportunity to work at the Eagle and Phoenix textile mill. And that's what he did his entire life until he retired. My grandfather left school in the 8th grade during the Depression to help take care of the family until World War II broke out. He enlisted in the Army. He served in the Pacific. He came home after the war ended. He married my grandmother. He worked a lot of different jobs. He was a milkman. He was a railroad conductor. He did a lot of different things. My grandmother worked at Commercial Printers in Columbus. They eventually put enough money together to start a little grocery store at 5th Avenue and 8th Street in downtown Columbus. They had a lot of different small businesses over the years. Had a laundromat, had a service station. My dad was the first member of our family to go to college. He worked at that same Eagle and Phoenix mill in the summertime to pay for his tuition at Auburn University. He went on to law school and is still today a lawyer in private practice, and I followed in his footsteps. I tell you all of that, first of all, to give you a little sense of where I come from, but also to say I feel like I have been given an awful lot by this country, by this state, by my community and my family. And so where my interest in public service comes from is just from the idea that to whom much is given, much is required. And that's where my interest in public service lies. So why the Secretary of State's office? Well, if you look at the last year or two, I can give you a pretty clear reason why I'm interested in being your next Secretary of State. It boils down to this. I want Georgia to be the fastest state in the nation for someone to be able to get a job, and I want it to be the hardest state in the nation for someone to cast an illegal vote. If you really just want to boil it down, that's what I would like to accomplish as your Secretary of State. But let's talk for just a moment about our voting situation in Georgia. The far left understands that they cannot win an honest election in Georgia. And so they've tried for years to make changes to Georgia election law at the state legislature, but they can't do that because the Republican Party is firmly in control of the state legislature. So what they've done instead is they run to Obama judges in the midst of an election and file these lawsuits to try to get the law changed in the middle of an election. Just to give y'all a quick example, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, y'all probably aware of that congressional election that occurred earlier this year. I know they spent a little money on television around here, advertising. But, that election was on April the 18th, and then there was a runoff on June 20th. Well, after the election on April the 18th, the far left runs to court and says, hey, you know how everybody had to register to vote by March the 17th to vote in this election? You need to change the rules in the middle of the game and extend voter registration all the way out to May 21st. Now, a runoff is not a separate election. A runoff is a continuation of an election. That's why if you vote in the Republican primary, you're not allowed to vote in the Democratic runoff and vice versa, because it's one election. It's not two separate elections. Well, we have an Obama district court judge who says, that's right, I'm going to extend it out to May 21st. What's the state's reaction to that? We just rolled over. 10,000 new people added to the voter rolls. And, fortunately, in my opinion, Karen Handel still won that election, but they were trying to put their thumb on the scale in the middle of an election. Your Secretary of State, when that sort of thing happens, if the left wants to rewrite Georgia election law, then we're going to need to go to the United States Supreme Court and let the United States Supreme Court tell us that we're going to change the election law. But we've made it very clear over the last several years that when the left sues, whether it's on what kind of ID to use for voter registration, all of these different things, we have caved over and over and over again. And it's not just those issues. Last year in two different Georgia counties, in Hall County and Gwinnett County, the far left sued. There's actually an article in this week's Atlanta Journal-Constitution about the far left pursuing litigation again to have ballots printed in languages other than English. Now let me be real clear about this. I embrace our culture and tradition of having legal immigration in this country and people from all over the world coming to America, coming to Georgia, coming to the metropolitan Atlanta area. That's great. And if you want to speak any language under the sun, that's fine with me too. But in order to become a United States citizen, you have to demonstrate a basic understanding of the English language. So yes, I believe that the price you pay to participate in our democratic process is you have to read English well enough to cast a vote. And I think the Secretary of State needs to be willing to stand up and say, that's our position, we're going to defend it. We will again go to the ends of the earth to defend that position, because we have to have, when the government speaks, the government should speak with a common language, and that language should be English. The other issue with voter integrity, driver's licenses. We've issued over 20,000 driver's licenses to illegal aliens in this state. Now, what happens when you get a driver's license? What happens when you go to DDS? Motor voter, right? They'll automatically register somebody unless they tell them, don't put me on the rolls. So we have invited in our system, by the way we're issuing these driver's licenses, putting people on the rolls who are not U.S. citizens. That's something that the Secretary of State needs to be outspoken about. We need to put an end to that practice. We need to recall the licenses that have been issued, and we need to scrutinize the list and make sure that's been taken care of. Absentee balloting, the same thing. The voter ID and several other aspects of the absentee balloting process need to be tightened up. In my home county, I'm from Columbus, Georgia, Muskogee County, Georgia, we had a situation 2 election cycles ago where a lady who worked at a nursing home in town shows up at the elections office with a stack of 19 absentee ballots that have all been filled out. They're unsealed. They're not in the envelope like they're supposed to be. But she was there to turn those in to have those votes counted. Now, just by happenstance, the Republican member of the Board of Elections happened to be there, started asking some questions. They go get the list of those 19 names. They find out there are people catatonic in the nursing home.
Yeah.
You know, they have no idea that they've signed anything requesting a ballot, much less casting a vote. Now, when the left talks about there being no voter fraud, those votes ultimately weren't counted, but they were only not counted because of the intervention of our Republican member of the Board of Elections. So there are a lot of things we've got to do to tighten up our process to make sure that no illegal votes are being cast. Now, I do want to talk about the voting machines. And this is something that I've learned an awful lot about, thanks to Garland and others who have been very active on this issue. To me, when you look at the question that people raise all the time is, you know, we want some kind of paper record. We want some way of validating the votes that are being cast. Well, to me, if you look at the experience Maryland has had, Maryland had optical scan ballots, which Georgia also had. For those of you that have cast a vote absentee recently or remember voting prior to 2002, you know those are the sheets kind of like a standardized test form where you bubble it in and it's run through a reader. Obviously, with that system, there's a paper record built in. There's a paper ballot that you have filled out in order to cast your vote. It's not about buying a new piece of technology that prints out some sort of receipt or has some other verifiable audit trail. So Maryland went back to the optical scan machines. From the financial information I've been able to see, it seems to me it will be a much better deal for taxpayers for us to go back to the optical scan machines than trying to either retrofit the machines we have or buying a new generation of electronic voting machines with some sort of paper audit trail attachment. So I want there to be an open process. I want there to be a process where competitive bidding is allowed. I don't want it to be like it was in 2002 where basically there was a decision made, this vendor, this model of machine, that's what's going to happen, and it's sort of preordained. But having said that, you know, my belief and what I would push for as Secretary of State would be a return to the optical scan ballot machines. That's what I believe is the best way, again, to assure the integrity of our process. I think we do need an audit, a performance audit from beginning to end of how our voting process works. You know, Secretary Kemp has recently announced that he's terminating this data center relationship with Kennesaw State. I think we need to do a complete review to figure out what process makes the most sense. I also think we need to go into the counties, and I have a lot of experience with this in Muskogee County. I know Fulton County and DeKalb County have issues with this as well, where everybody's getting a similar volume of votes. Everybody's handling a very similar task, yet these counties, it seems like 1 a.m., 2 a.m., maybe 3 a.m. before they actually have their reports in. There's something wrong with that process. And so the Secretary of State's office ought to be involved in helping those local communities figure out how to have a process that is working to where those votes are being tallied in a timely fashion. When you look around the country, lots of other large urban centers have figured this out. There are large population areas in Georgia that have figured this out. So there's something going on in those counties that needs to be resolved, and I think the Secretary of State's office has to play a role with that. So I've talked a lot about elections. I want to spend a few moments talking to you about professional licensing. You know, a lot of my colleagues in the General Assembly and some of the folks in the executive branch too love to talk about Georgia being the #1 state to do business. I think if I had $1 for every time I had heard that, I could probably just retire to an island somewhere at this point. But and I'm glad that Georgia has a pro-business environment. That's a good thing. But we ought to be looking at the total picture. There's a Georgia State University study that recently came out that showed Georgia has gone from 33rd in the nation to 41st in the nation in terms of middle-class families per capita, and among all the states. During the same period of time, we've gone from 21st in the nation to 15th for low-income families per capita. Well, what that tells me is that while we may have businesses locating here, we may have new corporate headquarters locating here, for that average person who's looking for the first rung on the ladder of economic success, things are getting harder for those folks, not easier. And I think particularly for folks on the center right, we need to be speaking directly to those folks. I think that the success that President Trump had was specifically because he was speaking to people who are in that area, who are struggling, who are not seeing a benefit in the current economic situation. So what can the Secretary of State's office do about that? Licensing reform, occupational licensing reform. Americans for Prosperity conducted a nationwide study and found that if we would reform our licensing processes to make it easier for people to get those occupational licenses, that 5.4 million new jobs could be created nationwide. 5.4 million new people working every day. Now, as a proud Republican, one of the things that I think Republicans ought to be talking about is how we can connect people to opportunities for honest, hard work. And why are we putting up these artificial barriers? How many hundreds of hours of training should someone have before the government gives them a piece of paper giving them permission to cut hair? You tell me. I mean, I think that there are a number of these occupational licenses where we can make it easier without in any way negatively affecting the public interest. So that's something that I'm going to be really committed to, because I think the best thing that anyone can do is give folks an opportunity to have the dignity of honest, hard work. And that's something we can do by making the licensing process a little bit easier for folks to navigate. The corporations division, that's the other big part of the office that people hear about a lot. I think that the delivery of online services can be improved. My professional life, when I'm not down at the legislature, I'm an attorney. I do some corporate work for some of my clients. And I can tell you, when I hand carry something into the office downtown, I usually get a better result than when I file something online. And we ought to be working that out and figuring out how to make it more user-friendly, easier for people to handle. I think the office needs to have a culture of customer service. I had a gentleman just the other day approach me and say, you know, I was calling, I had a problem, and, you know, the people were not very helpful, and I had a problem with sort of the attitude of the person talking to me. Well, no one should ever have an experience like that. You know, obviously, everybody in state government, from the elected officials on down, work for you, and we ought to have that attitude in the office. The Secretary of State does a lot of other things. There are a lot of different functions within the office. I always like to tell people one of my favorite functions the Secretary of State has is the Secretary of State is the state's boxing commissioner. So oversees, you know, if we ever had any boxing in Georgia, it would be on the Secretary of State's office. But there are lots of functions here and there, but the three big ones are what I've been talking with you today about: elections, licensing, and corporations. The last thing I'll leave you with, and then I'd be delighted to take some questions if there's time. Why me? You know, I'm not expecting, I know this is a group that's focused on issues, but I do want to explain to you as you talk to people, because you're thought leaders in your community, you know, well, why Josh McKoon? Why not one of the three other fellows running in the Republican primary? Everybody in the race, they're all good people. I think they're all principled people. The difference I would say to you is this: the far left is going to target whoever the next Secretary of State is. There's going to be a lot of pressure brought to bear. If the left spent $30 million trying to steal the 6th congressional district from the Republican Party, I can assure you that in 2020, when President Trump's running for re-election, Georgia's going to be dead in their crosshairs. And so you're going to want a Secretary of State who, when the pressure comes and the heat's on and the media's, you know, making some, you know, fake news controversy, that Secretary of State's willing to stand up and say, I'm going to be the guardian of the integrity of this electoral process. I'm not going to let the left intimidate me or cause me to fold at the 11th hour. Anyone who has seen what I've done in the General Assembly over the last 7 years, whether you like it or not, they can tell you, I'm not going to back down from a just cause. I'm not going to run away when the going gets tough. You need a fighter. You need somebody that's going to roll up their sleeves and do whatever's necessary to protect the electoral process. And I would submit to you, out of all the candidates in the field, I have demonstrated time and again that I have the intestinal fortitude to do that. So, we'd love to have you join our campaign. Matt Fuentes, who's there in the back, if you just wave at everybody, Matt, he's working with me, and we'll be hanging around after the meeting's over. Would love to get your information. Would love to have you join us and help us. It's a big state, so we're going to need a lot of help. But with that, I appreciate your time and would love to answer some questions.
Josh, thank you very much.
Yes, sir.
Without an endorsement, because we do not make endorsements. So typically what we do is go around the table and we start at different points. So we're going to start over here on this side and go around to the back and finish up over here.
Can I add one more
By all
thought?
means,
Just
please do.
the discussion of transparency reminded me of this. One other thing I think the Secretary of State's office needs to do and needs to be is a chief transparency officer for the state of Georgia. My friend and colleague in Ohio, Josh Mandel, who's the state treasurer there, pioneered a program called the Ohio Checkbook, and it's something I'd like to see Georgia do. It is an online database of all state spending broken down by agency down to a check register level. So you can go into a state agency, look at a specific day, and you can see how your tax money was being spent down to that expenditure level. So that's something that I'll be advocating for as we go through the campaign. Thank you for letting me add that.
Thank you. Okay, Mark, if you would stand up and listen.
All right, yeah, thank you so much for coming and speaking with us. In your opinion, do you believe that a Secretary of State's possibly #1 duty is to make sure that anyone running for elected office is legally qualified to serve?
Well, absolutely. I mean, there's no question the Secretary of State, whether you're talking about residency challenges or other qualification challenges, that ultimately gets in front of the Secretary of State. It's subject to judicial review beyond that. But yes, it's an important function of the job.
Thank you.
Come in, down the table, Carl.
Josh, I know you fought long and hard to get transparency in the state senate. Will that be something that you can continue to affect? Will that be in your view?
Well, yes. I mean, I think one of the things that that you can do as a statewide constitutional officer is, yes, you've got the duties of your job, and that's paramount. But you also have a platform to talk about what's important and the issues that are important. And you mentioned the issue about transparency in the state senate. For those of you that are not familiar with this, the House of Representatives for many years has provided their committee meetings online so that you could watch your legislature at work without having to be in downtown Atlanta. The state senate has not followed suit. So basically, if you wanted to be in a committee hearing, I'll give you an example from this year's session. Of course, we had a lot of debate about casino gambling, and there was a hearing on casino gambling. Well, if you wanted to be there, if you wanted to hear the debate and hear what was being discussed, you had to drive to downtown Atlanta, and you had to get to the committee room early enough to be in the committee room, because otherwise, the meeting's not available for anybody to watch. So what I did this year, after being told it was too expensive, how can we come up with technology that would allow us to broadcast these meetings, to the world? I said, well, okay, I'm going to use some technology available to me to do that. So I took this device right here, and I started live streaming every committee meeting of every committee that I serve on. And that meeting that I mentioned to you about casino gaming is kind of, I think, an amusing story, but it illustrates the point. There were so many people packed in the room that lobbyists who'd been hired by the casinos were not able to get into the meeting room.
Right.
So I'm on the committee, I'm live streaming the meeting. So in the room next door, one of the lobbyists pulls up my Periscope feed on their laptop, puts it on a big screen in the other room, and there's a whole nother meeting room full of people watching the live stream. So for the next several days, I would have lobbyists approach me, like in a dark corner and say, hey, thanks for doing that, and are you going to do that again? But what I'm proud to report to you is that after spending the entire session demonstrating how absurd it was to say there wasn't the technology available to do this, that next session, all Senate committee meetings are going to be live streamed. So we're going to continue to do that. I'll continue to fight for open and transparent government. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes, Josh, I remember being here the last time you came to visit with us.
Yes, sir.
And I'd like to thank you for your leadership. And I believe you were either the sponsor or co-sponsor for a bill in the last legislature for banking districts, areas of banking
Yes, sir.
districts.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to commend you for that. And just as you pointed out earlier about the left, I found it so interesting that right here in Cobb County, we have areas that are banking desert. And yet, of all the representatives, only Senator Michael Redd, I think, joined you on that bill. And I appreciate your ability to open the aperture and see that we're all part of the big picture at all levels. And I've said, unless you have a bank in your community, you really don't have a community. So I appreciate your leadership, and I would say if you carry that forth into the next level, I think we'll be fine.
Well, we are definitely, thank you for your comments. For those of you not familiar with this issue, Georgia, both in urban and rural areas, there are lots of communities that are largely unbanked, that don't have traditional financial institutions readily available to the communities. So you wind up, folks are generally reliant upon title pawn outlets, payday lenders, and it's very difficult to attract any investment in the community and get those kinds of things done. So we had a bill that I authored and Senator Rhett and some others co-sponsored that's modeled on Texas legislation, actually, that passed the Texas legislature 2 years ago. And what it does is it allows local governments, if they choose, to enter into a relationship with local banks. They can give them some incentives to build a brick and mortar bank facility in a banking desert type area to allow the community to have access to capital. It's been a tremendous success in Texas and in other jurisdictions that have adopted it. And again, it's more of a free market-based solution to lifting people out of poverty. So I appreciate you taking notice of that. Thank you, sir.
Garland?
Josh, this year, after two appeals, the U.S. Court of Appeals and a federal court declared a portion of the ballot access requirements in Georgia unconstitutional. The taxpayers paid over $250,000 in legal fees and probably incurred another $250,000 in defending the ballot access requirements because the Secretary of State and the legislature want to protect the petitioning so that you cannot run for office on a fair and equal basis unless you're a Democrat or Republican. What would you do as a state senator this coming session, as well as Secretary of State, to try to rectify that situation?
Well, thank you for that question, because that's something I should have mentioned in my earlier remarks. I think everyone in this room probably believes generally in the principles of the free market and the idea that more choices are better. I think that's certainly the debate we've been having about healthcare, right? More choices, more competition equals better outcome. It seems like the one place where that argument doesn't seem to get a lot of traction is when we're choosing elected officials. We've set up this duopoly. You have the Democratic primary process, the Republican primary process. But if you don't want to participate in those two processes, or if you want to represent another party, Georgia has, if not one of the most restrictive ballot access laws in the country. I have introduced legislation to eliminate the petition requirement for independent candidates. I feel like if I can go put $400 down and run for the state legislature, somebody else wants to do that on an independent line, they ought to have that same right. I think more choices lead to a better discussion and ultimately better elected officials. And I'll say this on the third party issue. Prior to 1946, the only requirement in order to field a line on the ballot for a third party was to field a full slate of statewide candidates. To me, that was a pretty fair rule. And then after World War II, during the height of the Red Scare, Georgia passed a law to say we want to keep the Communist Party off the ballot in Georgia at all costs. So the way we're going to accomplish that is by creating this very onerous ballot access process. But I don't know why, I don't know what the policy argument is to say no to the Green Party or the Constitution Party or to an independent candidate for office. So as a state legislator, I've introduced legislation to address those issues that, you know, we're going to try to move through the process. I'm certainly not going to make you any promises about that, but I'm going to keep speaking and advocating for it. And as Secretary of State, I will use that megaphone to talk about these issues about ballot access because, again, I think the more voices in our democratic process, the better result we're going to get. And we ought to welcome that debate. You know, I'm not afraid of more people running in an election. If I think I have the best ideas, I shouldn't be scared by that. And so we ought to have an open and fair process.
Deborah?
Okay, I have a couple of questions.
Deborah, the questions have to be on the same topic. No free raising.
Of this? Yeah, it has to do.
Yeah, but you said you had a couple of questions. You can have an exchange back and forth, but the subject that you opened with must be the subject of the dialogue.
Why did Kemp not do anything after the judge allowed registration after the primary? And if he did do something, what did he do? And can we go back to court to reverse this?
Okay, so great questions. The Secretary of State's office did, you know, defend the suit and took it to district court. And then when we lost at district court, essentially a decision was made not to appeal. The next step would have been to appeal to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. And you would have to ask Secretary Kemp and perhaps the Attorney General why they chose not to pursue the appeal. I'm going to tell you, as somebody who has practiced a little election law myself, it is very difficult for me to see if we had gotten to a judge who was not, you know, an Obama judge, if we'd gotten to a panel on the 11th Circuit, how they would have sustained a decision. Because again, the argument that the left was making in that case was, oh, well, this is a new election. The June 20th election is a new election, so registration needs to be reopened. Well, it's very clear in the statute, the statutory language, that a runoff is not a new election. It's a continuation of an election. So if it had been me, what I would have done differently is I would have taken that to the 11th Circuit. I would have requested a stay of that decision pending the appeal. What that would have meant is that there would have been no voter registrations processed while the stay was in place. So even had we lost on appeal, I believe by the time an appellate decision came down, the case would have been mooted because the election would have been over.
Why did he not do this? You don't know.
I'm not going to try and speak for Secretary Kemp. I'm just telling you what I would do in a similar situation. But it's not a forever and ever decision. You know, if this situation occurred again, I'm sure they'd sue again since they got a favorable decision. But the state could take that up on appeal.
So that's not a permanent
No, ma'am.
decision for all?
It was for that election. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Deborah. Next. You're doing great on all your answers. Frank?
To answer Deborah's question, the reason why Kemp didn't do it because he was attacked by the press saying he was suppressing the vote. And the Republicans have a problem with challenging the press, with the exception of the guy in the Oval Office. But anyway, I'm an advocate of closed primary. We have an open primary. You just register to vote. I think you should register to vote for a political party. These are corporations that should run their own operation. And I think when you register to vote, you register as an independent, libertarian, Democrat, or Republican, and you vote only in that primary. And that would get rid of a lot of nuisance voting or intrigue or things of that nature. I wish you would use your loudspeaker, your bully pulpit to advocate that. And we can run our own rules, election rules in the state of Georgia.
And let me just say, I agree with you completely on closed primaries and registration by party. You know, the state statute actually talking about controlling the operations, it says that the Democratic and Republican Party have to have primary elections. and all the other minor parties can only nominate by convention. That ought to be done away with. You know, again, these are private entities. They ought to be able to govern their own affairs. So I agree with you 100%.
Johnny?
Should the Secretary of State's office be nonpartisan? It seems like, just listening to your speech, it seems like you've already shown a huge amount of bias. You're talking about the far left, far left, far left. And it seems like it would be impossible for someone in your position to be fair in the election. If like the far left person is running, it seems like it would be impossible to not show bias in your conduct of the election.
Well, I want to be real clear about this. I think that the purpose of the Secretary of State is to safeguard the integrity of our electoral process. If that election yields the result that, you know, Bernie Sanders wins Georgia's electoral votes in a presidential election, you know, so be it. But my point is, the far left organizations and the litigation I'm talking about, it's all about making it much more difficult to preserve the integrity of the process. Why do we have a 30-day blackout window on voter registration? We have a 30-day blackout window on voter registration because it takes time after someone submits that voter registration to verify that they are who they say they are, that they live where they say they live. And so the litigation was designed to flood the system at the very last moment with a bunch of new voters and not give the jurisdictions adequate time to vet those voters. So then you get votes cast that may or may not be cast by someone that should be legally registered to vote. So I don't see that as a Republican or a Democratic position. I see that as a question of maintaining fair elections. I think I'm probably the only person in the race, Republican or Democrat, you'd have to ask them, who will say, I'm not afraid of the Green Party having ballot access. I'm not afraid of the, you know, Constitution Party having ballot access. So, you know, I have no problem being fair to all comers regardless of ideology. I don't want anybody putting their thumb on the scales and creating an unfair process. And I feel like we have a lot of risks built into the current system to create an unfair process.
Wouldn't having a nonpartisan Secretary of State be a better solution, though?
You know, I mean, ultimately that's a question that's up to the legislature. I mean, I don't think that, I'd never felt like Secretary Handel or Secretary Kemp have done anything to be unfair to folks in the other party. You know, it's obviously a question that people can debate and discuss, but the system we're in, it's a partisan election. I generally believe in partisan elections because I think that everybody comes to their position with a point of view. Now, if somebody wants to run as an independent, they can certainly do that. If somebody wants to run under another party, they ought to be able to do that. But I think, I personally think it's better from the top of the ticket all the way down for people to declare a party because it lets the public know what their sort of ideological mindset is.
Coming on up the table. Paul?
Got a question for you, young man.
Yes, sir.
There is a federal statute which says that if an individual does A, B, C, or A, B, or C, they are not qualified, and the statute uses the phrase, not qualified to hold federal office, any federal office. Now, assume for a moment that that is closely correct to the statement of the federal statute, and all of a sudden, you as Secretary of State find a political party putting up a candidate for president. And after that is done, the head of the FBI, speaking on behalf of the U.S. Justice Department, the United States Attorney, gets up in front of the entire population of the nation and says, yes, that party candidate was found to have done A, B, and C. As Secretary of State, you are charged with determining ultimately for the purpose of the state ballot whether or not that individual is qualified. Would you disqualify that candidate, after the party has nominated them, but then you find that here's this statute that says, and then you find the head of the FBI saying, yes, this candidate did this and this, would you go ahead and let that person be qualified to be on the ballot, or would you issue your notice that that individual was no longer qualified?
Now, based on the hypothetical you're giving
On the
me,
hypothetical.
yeah, I mean, I would absolutely have to disqualify that person, because you swear an oath when you take the office of Secretary of State to faithfully execute the laws of the state, and to observe I'm sorry, go ahead.
So what you're saying is, you would perform your duty based upon a preponderance of the evidence rather than evidence reaching either probable cause or reason beyond a reasonable doubt. In other words, you understand you have discretion.
Yes, I would apply the applicable standard of proof, whatever that may be. Yes,
Thank
sir.
you. You have my vote.
That's hard to come by.
I think this gentleman has a question.
Thanks for being here today, I appreciate that.
Yes, sir.
And what are the 5 major things that the Secretary of State does? And you've already mentioned quite a few of them. But what are the 5 major things?
So I would say they are elections, licensing, corporations. There's a securities division that doesn't do a whole lot of regulatory work, but there are certain entities that come under the Secretary of State's office for that purpose. And those are really, to me, those are the 4 major functions of the office.
How many employees?
If you add in the licensing division, the corporations division, and the elections division, in the Atlanta office alone, I think you got over 100. When you add in the satellite offices, I couldn't swear to you what the number would be for the total head count.
That's about 100 somewhere. And so what changes would you make to your organization there? What would you do with any of those 5 things? What major changes are in? Can you mention a couple of them?
Sure. I think in terms of the way the office is run day to day, one thing that I am aware of is that there's been a telecommuting policy in place for a while. I'd like to review that because I think there may be some issues related to some of the customer service issues I'm hearing about. So that's one thing I'd really like to explore. We will probably bring in a largely new team in terms of who's running the elections division. I have specific candidates in mind for that job who have a lot of experience with election administration, who I have a lot of trust and confidence in, because whoever comes into that job is going to oversee this transition process from the machines we're using now to the optical scan machines, the next generation voter machines that come in. So we need to make sure that transition is as smooth as possible, and so we got to have the right team in place. I would say on licensing, that's probably the single biggest policy change, and that's going to require a cooperation with the legislature. We'll have to move a package of items through the legislature to make that easier. But I feel confident when we show, we talk about all the time about tax giveaways and these other things to create jobs. If we can create opportunity for people to work and it doesn't cost the taxpayer a dime, I would hope that that's something the legislature would get behind. And from the conversations I've been having, I think there is a lot of support for that. The other big change I'll make on elections has to do with this 45-day runoff. For those of you that saw this advertising in the 6th district race, we endured this 9-week runoff. In 2012, because my Senate district neighbors Fort Benning, I have a relationship with some of the DOD folks. They came to me and said, look, Josh, Georgia's not complying with the federal Military and Overseas Voters Act. If y'all don't change your law, you're going to be sued and you're going to wind up having a 9-week runoff. And I brought this to the attention of the relevant parties. I was told it's no problem, we're going to win if we get sued. We got sued the next year, we lost, and then in 2014 we started having these 9-week runoffs. But we don't have to have 45 days. The statute says 45 days or another acceptable plan. Arkansas, South Carolina, Louisiana, Alabama, they've all figured this out. There are a number of solutions. You can do secure voting that can be transmitted through various means. There's ranked choice voting. Some people call it instant runoff voting, where the person just says, this is my number one, this is my number two, and so on, and the ballot's cast that way. But we need to pass a law that eliminates this 9-week runoff window, because all that does, our political process already gives so many advantages to the person with the most money. And having a 9-week runoff on top of it is just one more, if you raised all the money necessary to just stagger over the finish line and get into that runoff, now you got to go raise another whole big pile of money for this next 9-week campaign. Yeah. And when we had a 3-week runoff, I felt like that was plenty of time. Some people in election administration tell me 4 weeks because it'll give them a little more time for the ballot style and everything. But goodness, can you imagine if that election on June 20th had been over on May 20th or May the 12th? I mean, think about how much money wouldn't have been spent and all the needless electioneering that went on. So that's another thing that I would focus on.
We have a hard stop at 10:30. We've been around the room once, so to be fair to everybody, we've done that. But we can continue on till 10:30 unless you have another obligation.
No, I'm
So
with
I'm
you.
going to leave it up to you to pick the people to call on.
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Would you, Ossoff, of course, lived in District 5 and he ran in District 6.
Mm-hmm.
Would you support a candidate to be required to live in the district they run in? And can we pass legislation for that?
So the answer to that, yeah, you're hearing the answer to that question. Not at the state level. There's a the federal Constitution outlines the requirements to be a member of Congress. And that is that you be a resident of the state. So if you wanted that change, you'd actually need to amend, I think you'd need to amend the Constitution to do that. Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
Hey, I've been here once before with Sabrina, not a regular, but my name is Stephen Humphries.
Stephen, will you announce
Oh,
the
hey.
board member?
I am not, does that mean I can't?
Yes, it does.
Okay.
What question do you want asked? Holly? Because I do have another question when you can get around to it.
Well, yes, sir. I'm happy to answer your question.
Okay. Now, keep in mind your answer might cause me to have to rethink a prior statement.
Yes, sir. I understand.
Get a vote in the balance.
In the state of Georgia, what governmental entity is recognized as having the power to judge the law?
To judge the law?
Judge the law. Specifically stated in our Constitution. Hold on before you go any further.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm sorry I caught you short. In our Constitution, there is one entity acknowledged with the power to judge the law, and I mean those specific words. That's the grand jury and a criminal trial jury in criminal cases. Now, my question to you is this: if a federal idiot in a black robe makes a mistake, instead of going to the Supreme Court with the question, why not bring it back to the people who are clothed with the authority to judge the law? Do you understand?
Yeah, no, I understand what you're saying. I think that when it comes to a matter of, a federal challenge or a challenge colored under federal law to a Georgia election procedure, that if we have had a negative finding in district court, I think in order to overturn it, we need to go to the 11th Circuit to have it overturned. And I'm not disagreeing with you about the constitutional role of the grand jury. I just think that you would have a conflict in the law, I guess, let's play it out. So we lose at district court, We present it, I mean, you know, you don't really have a statewide grand jury. I've tried to change
You
the,
don't need a statewide grand jury.
so,
Any grand jury in this state, any of the 159 grand juries, their jurisdiction, here's one of the problems, one of the things that people and sometimes politicians don't understand, is a grand jury, under normal circumstances, concerns themselves with allegations of criminal activity or misconduct that occurs within the geographic boundary of their county.
Yes, sir.
Okay?
Yes, sir.
We can all agree on that.
Yes, sir.
But here's the problem. A crime committed down in Savannah, Georgia is as much a crime against, even though I'm not the victim, it is still an offense against me up in Bartow County.
yes, sir, because the action's brought on
Thank you
behalf
for
of the state.
understanding that.
Yes, sir.
Which means if all of a sudden, out of nowhere, I come up with evidence that I know who the perpetrator was and I know the crime committed, I can go to the grand jury and get a probable cause determination up in Bartow County. I don't need to go to Chatham County.
I understand what you're saying.
Thank you
Yes, sir.
for understanding that. Now, you're doing good on getting my vote. Nailing it.
Get all of them, right?
So the question then presents itself, if a federal law, let's say, is passed and signed into law, but that federal law commits an act of theft in Cobb County, does a Cobb County grand jury have jurisdiction to consider that allegation?
I think you absolutely could present it. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Now you just nailed down my vote.
Yes, sir.
They changed the laws back in the 80s to take the poor people off of the ballot so the poor people couldn't run for office. So then basically now you have to have like an unbelievable number of signatures. It's impossible. Pretty much they took all the poor people off the ballot because the LaRouche people recruited poor people to run for office and they didn't like the competition. What's your opinion on that, on the high level of keeping the poor people off the ballot?
So I think the petition requirement should be eliminated. I represented 3 gentlemen in Stewart County, Georgia last year who were running for county. 2 of them were running for county commission. 1 was running for clerk of superior court as independents. Everything down there gets decided in the Democratic primary. They didn't feel like they could get a fair shake. They went around, they did the petitions, they got the signatures, and then the Board of Elections disallowed signatures, came up with all kinds of absurd pretexts for why signatures needed to be disallowed. So I sued on their behalf. We got in front of a Superior Court judge. We got all those things overturned. But of course, the problem, to your point, is people who don't have resources, first of all, it's almost impossible to comply with the petition requirement. And then if you do, you're almost certainly going to be challenged and then need legal help to try to overcome that. So I believe the petition requirement should be eliminated.
Okay, Garland?
Greg, I love to hear you say that. I wanted to go back. I know one of the issues that you've been so concerned on over the years is RFRA. And could you just give us an update on the cases there? And I'm particularly interested in the Augusta case, because I haven't heard much about that, about the college case, and I'm following some of the other ones, but
Yeah, so
talk to the actual discrimination that's occurred.
So there's the most recent case that I'm aware of occurred over at Georgia Gwinnett College. And at Georgia Gwinnett College, there was a young man, he's still there, an exchange student actually, from out of the country, who wanted to be able, as part of his faith tradition, to do open air preaching, street preaching, if you will, basically standing in a public area and preaching the gospel. That's what he wanted to do. So he tries to do this. He's told, oh, you've got to apply to be in the designated free speech zone. You know, you have a certain day and time that you can do this. So he goes down to the university office. He files all the paperwork. They give him his date and time to be in this free speech zone. And he shows up with a friend of his, a friend's passing out some literature, and he starts to preach. Well, about 15 minutes into his designated hour or two he has campus police approach him and say, you're disturbing some of the other students, you're going to have to stop. And he says, well, wait a minute. You know, I went through all the appropriate process, the university signed off on this, and they say, no, you're going to have to stop. So he goes back to complain. He stops. I mean, he complies with the police, but he stops and he goes back to complain, and he's told, well, your type of message is not welcome at Georgia Gwinnett College. So that case is in federal court. So the state of Georgia has filed a brief saying, and this has been our argument about RFRA the whole time, right? It's all about the legal standard. Rational basis versus strict scrutiny. Rational basis means the government can shut me up for any reason, as long as it's a reason. The state of Georgia, in the brief, says all we need is a rational basis. And the rational basis here is he was disrupting or disturbing some students who were having lunch or something. Well, that shouldn't be enough to abridge a fundamental First Amendment freedom. And to me, that case, it's continuing to be litigated. Alliance Defending Freedom's representing the young man on the other side, and they're taking a free speech argument because they know they won't win on the free exercise claim at the state level because of our much lower standard. But it exposes the reason we've been pursuing this from the beginning. And guess what? That has nothing to do with anybody's sexual orientation or wedding vendor or any of that. It has to do with the state abridging someone's constitutional right of free exercise. So that's probably the most recent example I could give you of why we need to make a change.
But to address the case, do you recall what
I'm not sure I'm familiar with a case out of Augusta.
I'm sorry, college.
There's a Savannah State case. Now that case ultimately was litigated and the case was settled. What happened at Savannah State was there was a group of Christian students. They had a fellowship group. They had a discipleship retreat on campus, and they were thrown off campus because a university bureaucrat said that having a foot washing ceremony violated anti-hazing policies at Savannah State University. And so they spent 3.5 years litigating that until the university finally settled. And people say, well, why do we need this? The students won. Well, of course, there aren't a whole lot of 18-year-olds who are going to think, an authority figure is telling me something's wrong, I better go run get a lawyer and go to court and litigate. And of course, if you were a freshman when this all started, you're graduating when it's over, so really it becomes moot for you. But that's the other case. Yes, sir.
Got another question.
I feel like I'm taking a big risk. You already told me I got your vote.
You have no idea. Let's discuss sovereign immunity for just a moment.
Yes, sir.
The king can do no wrong.
Yes, sir.
My first question to you, how do you interpret that phrase, the king can do no wrong? Is it an admission of a fact, or is it an admonition to a sovereign?
Well, I would say that the doctrine of sovereign immunity under state law in Georgia has been broadened greatly by recent Supreme Court decisions in a way that I find very disturbing. And I worked on legislation. I worked on legislation with Wendell Willard over in the House to narrow the scope of sovereign immunity. It was House Bill 92, and Governor Deal vetoed that bill.
Well, I can understand that.
Yeah. But we have to, and I just want to give you a quick example of why this is so dangerous. I had 4 taxpayer clients in Coweta County down in Noonan. There was a county commission meeting where they went through an entire meeting, got to the end, went into executive session, came out, amended their agenda to add an item to adopt a retirement agreement for a deputy fire chief. They adopted the agreement. Nothing was in writing. A week later, when the agreement gets written, they doubled his benefit and accelerated the benefit by 16 years so he could start being paid immediately. So we sued, saying they were violating the Open Meetings Act by not publishing that on the agenda in advance. The county attorney took the position that private citizens cannot file lawsuits to enforce the Open Meetings Law. Now, thankfully for us, a trial court judge didn't agree, but the current state of Georgia Supreme Court and appellate court decisions on that subject, I'm not sure if that had gone up on appeal if we would have prevailed or not. So it is very disturbing how broad sovereign immunity currently is.
In a recent case that is currently on appeal, you're correct. The appellate system in this state seems bent on extending sovereign immunity to cover literally cover criminal acts. So my question, I suppose, to you is do you support that extension
No, sir.
to cover criminal acts?
No, sir. And as a matter of fact, I think it is vitally important that the legislature send back to Governor Deal again the bill that we passed 2 years ago to dramatically narrow sovereign immunity in the state.
Well, let me make a suggestion. As soon as you get back to Columbus, Georgia, find out who your chief judge is on your grand jury foreman,
Yes, sir.
and ask to speak to the grand jury and bring this issue of sovereign immunity. And does the grand jury believe that it is the appellate court's authority to expand sovereign immunity to keep people from either bringing suit or criminally prosecuting crimes committed in the name of the state? Now, I'm gonna tell you, if you don't go talk to your grand jury foreman, I'm gonna have to seriously reconsider.
Yes, sir. I hear you loud and clear.
You've got one minute.
Because, you know, not even the Supreme Court justices have the authority in our Constitution to judge the law.
Yes, sir.
Only, so if they're covering up crimes, if judges are allowing criminal acts to be covered up by state officers,
You won't ever get in a fight with him.
hey, you know, the grand jury's got the power, they can send them to trial.
Absolutely.
Make
Let's
them,
not
make
have a
them.
side
Oh,
conversation.
excuse me, let me hush.
Paul, then your question brings another question into mind. The one that a Madison Forum member argued before the Georgia State Supreme Court. And that goes back to the referendum, or the bond referendum for the stadium. Because the Georgia Constitution states very emphatically, and it's not clouded in a lot of questionable language, that in order for a bond to be approved, the citizens of that county must conduct a referendum. So the citizens vote on it. Cobb County Commission voted for that to fund the Braves. It never went to a referendum. And then it went to the Supreme Court, and we had a Madison Forum member, Larry Savage, non-attorney, and there may have been another Madison Forum member, there were three, arguing, you can see it on YouTube. But the Georgia State Supreme Court said, oh, well, that's perfectly legal. They ruled against the Constitution. It was a unanimous ruling, which meant that every county in the state of Georgia, the county commission could conduct a vote, and even if it's one person, and obligate the citizens of that county for whatever amount of money that they want. Okay? So, it almost, based upon Paul's question, leads into a county grand jury, or even a state grand jury, rule on that, rule on the law that the Georgia Supreme Court, and it's beyond me, I don't want to say they're corrupt, because I've not studied their reasoning.
I will.
Okay, but anyway, that's the question too.
Yeah, I think, again, you know, the concern with that issue and with some more recent decisions is that the doctrine of sovereign immunity as being articulated by our appellate courts is getting to a point where they are saying that a citizen cannot even question the constitutionality of a state action, or challenge the constitutionality of a state or local statute. And so, again, from my perspective, I think that it is very, very important for the legislature to act to specifically narrow sovereign immunity to what it really was prior to this decision in a case called Sustainable Coast in 2014. But unless and until the legislature acts, I think we're going to see that continue to, that's going to be more and more of an issue for us. Yes, sir.
Josh, just to follow up on the Braves bond issue for a second, I'm going to put it in a slightly different context. To me, I think essentially the Supreme Court wound up ruling that that Cobb County had figured out a structure to make the bonds they issued not illegal. But I think that it still was a scheme that got around the intent of the Georgia Constitution. Likewise, with Cobb County SPLOST, the intent of the legislature on the SPLOST was that it should be done in a certain way. Cobb County has been expanding, broadening the way they use it to where, to a large extent, there are a bunch of slush funds now built into the SPLOST that I think are not the original intent of the legislature. So my question is, with regard to issuing bonds, with regard to SPLOST, I don't know why the legislature can't go back and clarify state law to say, no, here's the intent of the law, and then legislate some new clarifications that would stop certain practices that are against the intent of the law.
So to answer your question, I'm not familiar with the specifics of the Cobb County bond issue. I can tell you that in my home county, we had a situation where there was a leaseback arrangement made with a private equity firm in New York in order to use bonding capacity in a way that circumvented the referendum laws. I don't know if it was the same circumstance in Cobb, but I do think, taking it back to a comment I made earlier, there needs to be someone in state government who is speaking up for these issues about transparency and accountability. And I think that one of the things we need to talk about, open meetings, open records, and then yes, making sure if you're encumbering taxpayers, the taxpayers ultimately ought to have to approve that. I agree with you. Yes, sir.
Josh, you had talked a little bit about, you had introduced petitioner requirements, I'll go back to that for a second, to a legislation to remove petitioner requirements. I'm not familiar with that, but could you talk a little bit about that? I'm curious to know, would you be willing to do that in the next session, such as something like House Bill 494, that Rusty Kidd had to remove all the petitioner requirements in Georgia?
Yes, I mean, I've filed that bill, so it's active for this biennium. I'll get you the bill number, but it's sitting in the ethics committee along with a lot of my other bills. But yes, sir. Yeah, and I'll be glad to get you the bill number. But it's very simple. Just say, look, if you otherwise comply with the qualification requirements, you should be granted access to the ballot. It's just that simple.
Thank you.
All right, well, I guess that's everybody. Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity.